She stood on the auction platform with her wrists chained too high, and even bleeding she would not lower her head. Bram saw the orc woman before he saw anything else in the yard. Her skin was the olive lime green of river reeds in late summer, gone dull now under road dust and the dried blood at her temple. One pointed ear was notched. Her eyes moved across the crowd the way a soldier counts exits, and found none, and it did not make her look away. When the clerk cracked his cane against the boards to hurry the bidding, she flinched, just once, just in the shoulders, and then made herself still, and that small failed effort to hide the flinch was the thing that reached into his chest and would not let go. He had come for a horse. He had a horse's worth of coin knotted in a rag against his belly, because the ferry winch had thrown its old draft mare, and the slate did not stop for a man's bad luck. The clerk's voice climbed, sound of limb, broke to hard labor, and a proven fighter besides. Who opens? Bram's hand was already up. He heard himself do the thing he always did when the ground tilted under him. Count, low and private, 4 boards, 5, 6, breathing on the numbers until they held him. A voice behind him laughed. Coin, answered coin, and across the yard, without knowing why, the orc woman found his face in the crowd and held it, not with hope, because she had none to spare, but with a flat green attention that felt like being weighed. That was when the man in the oiled coat lifted 2 fingers and doubled the bid. Bram knew him, everyone on the river knew Vardek. He owned the ring, the pit under the tannery where men paid to watch bonded fighters open each other for sport, and he bought the way a butcher buys, by the pound, by the fight left in. A thing. His 2 fingers said he had already priced her and meant to have her, and the crowd settled to watch a ferryman get taught his place. Bram lifted the rag of coin over his head so the clerk could see it whole, and he named a number that was every copper he owned, and 11 he did not. He should have lost. He had no more to give, and Vardek had a pit's worth of purse. But Vardek hesitated. His fingers came halfway up and stopped, and in that hitch Bram understood, cold and sure, that the strange woman in the smoke-dark house had told him the truth. Vardek could not go higher today. His money was spoken for, promised to men worse than himself, and Bram knew it because he had paid to know it the night before. Once, the clerk called. Twice. The cane came down to the ferryman. The yard let out its breath, half jeering, half delighted. Bram climbed the platform steps, on legs that did not feel like his, and up close she was taller than him and worse hurt than he had let himself see, and she looked at the rag of coin in his fist and said quietly, in plain trade speech, "You've bought a bad bargain. I break things." "I know," Bram said. "The bell won't chime for a while yet. Can you walk to the river?" And here's the part that mattered, the part he would turn over for the rest of his life. He had not been able to afford her. He had gone the night before to Mother Sable, who kept a house at the end of Tanner's Row, and kept the town's secrets the way other people kept chickens. For the eggs he had gone to borrow, she had taken his coin for a reading he did not ask for, laid no cards, lit no smoke, only looked at him a long while and told him exactly how high Vardek could bid, and not a copper more. Then, at the door, unpaid and unwanted, she had given him a fortune. "You'll free her," Mother Sable had said, "and the freeing will cost you the thing you buried. You've been paying that debt in your sleep for 9 years, ferryman. Now you'll pay it awake." And she had pressed a bent coin into his palm, a copper folded near double, as if a horse had stepped on it, and said, "Keep this. It always comes back to me." He had thought her mad, or greedy, or both, and he had used her numbers anyway. Now he stood on the platform with a freed woman he could not feed, and a bent coin in his pocket, and the only true thing he understood was the question she had left him. What had he buried, and how could a stranger know he was still paying for it? Her name was Yorsha. He learned that on the walk to the ferry, and little else, because she gave words the way a stone gives water. The clerk had handed him a strip of hide with a smeared mark on it, the sail tally, and warned him with a grin that a bought orc was one thing and a freed one was another, and that Dreywick had rules about strays. Bram had not understood the grin then. He understood it. Within the week, the ferry was a broad, flat scow that ran on a rope across the slate, hauled by a winch. A horse turned. With the mare dead, Bram turned it himself, and Yorsha, on the third morning, without being asked, and without a word, put her shoulder to the bar beside him and turned it too, and the crossing it took him a groaning quarter hour took the two of them a third of that. She did it not for him, he thought, but because idleness sat worse on her than work, and because a person who has been a tool learns to reach for tools to feel like a person again. He did not thank her. Thanks would have named the thing between them, and the thing between them had no safe name yet. He cleaned her wounds that first night with river water and a rag, in the small, terrible patience of a man who has doctored horses. The gash at her temple he closed with a fishing hook and gut, and she let him, watching his hands, not his face. The stripes across her back he only cleaned and would not touch further, and she noticed that he would not, and something in her uncoiled by a single degree. Why, she asked, did the ferryman spend 11 coppers he didn't have? Bram counted the stitches he had left. 4, 5, and made himself answer plainly. You flinched, and then you hid it. I've spent my life around things that can't hide it. I couldn't watch him by that. Pity, she said, tasting the word like spoiled meat. Maybe, he said. You can go. Come morning. The road's yours. I only ask you don't take the scow. I've got no horse to replace it. She did not go. Come morning. She stayed, she would say much later, because the door had been open, and no one had been standing in it, and in her whole remembered life that had never once been true. Trust did not arrive. It was built plank by plank, and every plank cost. Petch cost him first. Petch was the smith. On the town side, a wide slab of a man who had shod Bram's mares for a decade and stood him. Al, when the river was low, when Bram brought the ferry across and Yorsha stood at the bar, Petch sat down his hammer and said what half the town was thinking, that Greenskins had broken his cousin's holdfast contract and cost him a season's iron, that a freed orc drew slavers and trouble like meat draws flies, and that Bram was a fool. Wearing a fool's face? Bram did not argue him. He only said Yorsha turned the winch better than any horse and asked Petch to make her a proper bar harness so the rope would stop skinning her hands. Petch stared at him. Then he stared at Yorsha's hands, which were skinned, and he was a craftsman before he was a bigot, and the harness was on the scow by week's end, made without a word and without a bill. It was not friendship, it was the first plank. Gessa cost him coin he did not have. She was the herb woman above the fish market, and when the temple wound went hot and red, and Yorsha burned 3 nights with fever, it was Gessa Bram fetched, and Gessa, who came because she came for anyone, and who packed the wound with poultice and sat the last night through. On her way out, she told Bram the fever would break and the price would be dear, and it was both. He paid her in ferry crossings for a season, which was the same as paying in the one thing he had, and Gessa took it, and after that, when townsfolk asked her about the ferryman's orc, she said only that the orc had a strong heart and a bad master once, and let them wonder which master she meant. The physical threats came slower and worse. A week after the fever broke, 2 of Vardyk's pitmen crossed on the ferry at dusk and did not want the far bank. They wanted to look at Yorsha, to price her the way Vardyk priced everything, and one of them put a hand on her arm to feel the muscle of it as if she were still standing on the boards. Bram was mid-river with the harness on, and Yorsha did not wait for him. She broke the man's finger with a calm economy that told Bram more about her 9 lost years than any story could, and she said, in trade speech, I break things, and the 2 of them went to the far bank and did not come back that season. But they told Vardyk, and Vardyk, who did not forget a bit he lost, began to remember Yorsha. There was a night that cost him more than coin. A guild rider came to the ferry with a writ collector's badge and told Bram that harboring an unmarked orc was a fine of 10 crowns, or the loss of his crossing rights, and that the fine went. Away if the orc went back to the block. Bram had 10 crowns exactly, saved against the winch cradle he still hadn't built, and he counted them into the rider's hand on the scow's wet boards while Yorsha watched from the bar, saying nothing, expecting nothing, because expecting things was a habit that had been beaten out of her young. When the rider was gone, she asked him why, when a fine was a fine and she was only an expense. Bram said the cradle could wait another year, and that a thing you paid to keep was a thing you decided to keep, and he did not look at her while he said it, and she noticed that this time it was not because he couldn't bear to look, but because he was giving her the room to. She kept a cord of braided leather knotted at her wrist, old and grease-dark, and Bram noticed that when she was thinking she would work it loose and braid it again, 3 strands over, the same pattern each time. He did not ask about it. He had learned that questions were a currency with her, and he was poor in it. But one evening, mending net beside her, he found himself counting his knots aloud without meaning to. 4, 5, 6, the old habit, and Yorsha's hands went still on the cord. She looked at him, then the way she had looked at him from the platform, weighing and for a. Long moment. The fire and the river were the only sounds. Then she went back to her braid, and Bram did not know he had stepped on the buried thing until it had already begun to rise. It rose 3 nights later, and it broke everything open. There was a ford upriver where the slate ran shallow in dry weather, and Bram took the cart there to gather stone for a new winch cradle, and Yorsha came to lift what he could not. It was hot. The stone was heavy. When they stopped at midday, he filled the dipper from the ford, and because his hands were full and his mind on the cradle, he did the thing he had done 10,000 times without thought. He held the dipper out to her without looking at her face, his eyes on the water, counting the cart's slats. Under his breath, 4, 5, 6, so the reaching would not undo him. Yorsha did not take the dipper. When he finally looked up, her face had gone a color he had no name for, the green of it, gray underneath, and she was staring at him as though a dead man had spoken. "Say it again," she said. Her voice was very quiet. "Count again." He didn't understand. He counted, uncertain, 4, 5, and she flinched exactly as she had flinched on the platform, in the shoulders, and this time she did not hide it. "There was a wagon," she said, 9 years ago. Halimir Holdfast, after your soldiers broke the contract stones and called it spoil. I was 14. They chained us in a wagon, and a boy drove it, a levy boy who wouldn't look at our faces, not once the whole 3 days, because if he looked, he would have to know. At a ford like this one, on the 2nd day, a child was crying with thirst, and the boy who wouldn't look reached back a dipper of water without looking, and he counted under his breath while he did it, 4, 5, 6, so his hand wouldn't shake. She stood. I have hated that counting for 9 years, ferryman, because it was the only kindness on that road, and it came from the hand that drove us to the block. Bram could not speak. The dipper was still in his hand. "You bought me back," Yorsha said, and now her voice shook, "with a fortune woman's coin, and I thought it was pity. It wasn't pity, it was you. You sold me the first time, and 9 years later you paid to buy back what you'd sold, and you didn't even know my face when you did it, because you never once looked." Everything Mother Sable had said stood up at once and made its terrible sense. The debt he had been paying in his sleep, the freeing that would cost him, the thing he buried. She had not seen a mystic vision. She had heard him, some drunk river night in her smoke. Dark house. Count out a memory he could not keep down. She had known Yorsha's Halimir cord on sight from the slaver. Ledgers she read like scripture, and she had put the 2 of them in 1 yard and let the truth do what truth does. The fortune had never been about Yorsha. It had always been about him. He did the only thing left that was honest. He did not defend himself. He said, "Yes, it was me. I was 17 and I told myself I had no choice, and I drove that wagon to Draywick, and I took the pay, and I deserted a month later because I couldn't stomach what I'd done, and I've not been able to say it out loud in 9 years. I gave a child water so I could go on lying to myself that I was not the worst thing in that wagon. I was. I am sorry, and sorry is nothing, and I know it's nothing. Yorsha did not forgive him. She walked back to the ferry alone, and she was gone from the far bank by morning, and Bram sat by a cold winch and understood that he had freed her twice and lost her both times. He went to Mother Sable in a fury that burned out before he reached her door. She was waiting, of course. She was always waiting. "You used me," he said. "You used us both. You knew who she was. You knew whose fault I was. You put her on that block for me to find, like a snare set for a rabbit." "I did," Mother Sable said, unbothered, pouring him nettle tea he did not want. "I have a business, ferryman. I find people who owe more. Then money and I make the debt come due. Sometimes the coin of it goes to buy the next Yorsha off, the next block. She'd have gone to Vardyk's ring and been dead by winter, and you'd have gone to your grave, with your neat little counting habit, and never once paid. I made you pay. You'll thank me or you won't. It's the same to me." "She's gone," he said. "She's on the North Road," said Sable, walking to a holdfast that isn't there anymore, because there's nowhere else a freed orc without a magistrate's manumission mark can go. "And there's the second thing. You didn't know you buried." She set down the pot. "That hide tally the clerk gave you isn't worth spit in Draywick. A bought orc is property, and a freed one is a stray, and a stray can be claimed by any guildman. Who files on her before a warden? Vardyk filed this morning. He's calling her his by right of the pit contract. She was sold under, and Warden Holt will hear it in 3 days, and Holt owes the guild more than he owes his own name. If she's on the North Road when the writ goes out, she's a runaway. They can take her legally, and the ring is where they'll take her." The fury was gone. Something colder and steadier came up under it. "Then I'm not paying you in thanks," Bram said. "I'm paying you in your own coin. You said everyone owes. Warden Holt owes. Vardyk owes. You keep the ledgers. Give me the leverage, and I'll spend it. For the first time, Mother." Sable looked at him with something close to respect. "Now you're worth the reading," she said. "He found Yorsha at the North Ford by dark, sitting where the road forded a dry creek because she had nowhere to be that was hers. She did not send him away. She did not welcome him. He sat at a careful distance and told her plainly what Vardyk had done, and that in 3 days Warden Holt would hand her back to the pit under the color of law, and that running only made the writ true. So I run, and I'm a runaway, or I stay, and I'm claimed," Yorsha said. "You brought me a better cage. Congratulations." "I've brought you a fight," Bram said. "In front of the whole town, in front of witnesses, where Holt can't rule in a back room. You don't have to trust me. You have to let me stand where the town can see me and say what I did, not to be forgiven. To make it cost me, out loud, the way it's cost you quiet for 9 years. And you get to speak. Not through me. You." She was silent a long time. The dry creek ticked and settled. "Why would you burn yourself?" "Down in front of them," she said. "You'd lose everything. The ferry, Petch, whatever small clean life you built on top of me." "Because a clean life built on top of you," Bram said, "isn't clean. I've counted my way past it. For 9 years. I'm done counting." He took the bent coin from his pocket, the one Sable had folded near double, and he set it on the stone between them. She said, "This always comes back to her. Maybe. But it stops. With me first." Yorsha looked at the coin, and then at him, for a long time. She did not pick it up. But at dawn she walked back to the ferry beside him, and that was answer enough to begin. They had 3 days, and they did not waste one. Bram did not have a magic document, and he knew a single speech would only get him laughed out of the yard, so he built the thing the way he built everything, plank by. Costly plank, and he did not build it alone. He went to Petch and told him the whole of it, the wagon and the counting in Hollowmere, expecting the smith to spit and turn away. Petch listened with his big face gone. Still, and at the end, he said only, "My cousin lost a season's iron to that contract, and I hated greenskins. For 10 years, and this whole time, the man who broke it was a warden taking Vardik's bribes and blaming the orcs so nobody would look at him." He wiped his hands. "I've shod half the dockmen in Dreywick. They'll come stand in a yard. Free men don't like being sold a story either." That was Petch's plank. He went to Jessa. And Jessa did not need asking twice, because Jessa had spent 15 years pulling boys out of Vardik's ring with. Their skulls stove in, and she had names and dates and a book of the dead she kept because someone had. 2. She had testified to no warden because no warden would hear her over the guild, but a yard full of dockmen was not a warden. "Get me the crowd," she said, "and I'll get you the truth about the ring, and let Holt rule against 40 witnesses if he dares." And Bram went to the freed and the bonded folk along the river, the ones Mother Sable had bought off blocks with the coin she squeezed for men like him, and Sable, for her own cold reasons, let them be found. 3 of them had lived in the ring, 2 of them had Hollowmere, cord at their wrists, the same 3 over braid as Yorsha's, and when Yorsha saw them, the flat green wing left her face for the first time, and something younger came up under it, something that had been 14 once and had thought itself the last of everything. Warden Holt heard the claim in the market yard because Bram, through Petch's dockmen, had made sure it could be heard nowhere else. The yard was full. Vardik came in his oiled coat with the pit contract in his hand, smiling, because a contract in a warden's court is a thing that wins. The orc was sold under a ring bond, Vardik said, and a bond doesn't die because a ferryman felt tender at an auction. She's mine by contract. Read it, warden. Holt reached for the contract, and here is where a lesser day would have ended, with one paper deciding a life. It did not end there. Bram stepped into the open before Holt could read, and he did not make a speech. He said one thing, loud enough for the whole yard. Before the warden reads that, let him read who broke the Hollowmere contract stones that made these bonds. It wasn't the orcs. I was there. I was a levy conscript under a captain paid out of Dreywick's own guild purse, and I drove the wagon, and I'll say every name I remember, starting with the warden's brother who signed the spoil writ. The yard went loud, Holt went white, and Bram, standing in front of the town he had lived quiet in for 9 years, told them plainly what he had done and who had paid him to do it, and it cost him exactly what he had promised it would cost. The ferry contract was town granted, and a man who names the guild does not keep town grants. And he said it anyway, and the dockman who did not like being sold a story listened. Then he stepped back, because it was not his to finish. Jessa read from her book of the dead. 11 names in 3 years, boys and bonded folk carried out of the ring, and she named the knights and the wagers, and the yard that had come to see a ferryman shamed found itself doing sums about the man in the oiled coat. The 3 ring survivors spoke, one and then the next, of doors that only opened one way. And Yorsha spoke last, and she did not speak to Holt. She turned and spoke to the yard, in trade speech clear as a bell, and she told them about a wagon and a boy who counted, and about a contract broken by the very men who now held her to it, and she said, "You want to know if I'm property or a stray. I'll tell you the third thing, I'm a witness, and so is everyone standing here." Warden Holt looked at the pit contract in his hand, and looked at the yard full of dockmen and erbwomen and freed folk, and his own brother's name loose in the air, and he was not a brave man, but he was a man who could count a crowd. He ruled that a contract founded on an unlawful spoil writ could not be enforced, that Yorsha's bond was void, and because Mother Sable had made sure a magistrate from the river court stood in the crowd, a quiet man who owed her and could sign what Holt could only say, the manumission mark was set on New Hyde that same hour in front of 40 witnesses, which no back room could ever unmake. Vardik tore his contract and swore he'd have the ferryman ruined, and he did ruin the ferryman, and it did not matter as much as he thought, because the town had watched, and a thing watched cannot be quietly undone. The winter after was lean. Bram lost the town grant and the ferry with it, and for a while they lived thin in the smith's back. Lot, because Petch would not hear of otherwise. But a freed woman with a manumission mark and a ferryman with a river's worth of knowledge are not nothing, and by spring they had a smaller scow of their own on a stretch. The guild did not own, and Yorsha turned the winch beside him in Petch's harness, and turned it better than any. Horse. She kept the bent coin. She had picked it up off the stone of the North Ford, after all. One morning when Bram wasn't looking, and she wore it on the Holomere cord at her wrist, folded copper against greased leather. When Mother Sable sent word, once, that the coin was hers by right and always came back to her, Yorsha sent word back that it had come as far as it was coming, and Sable, who respected a person who paid their debts and refused their leash, let it lie. Bram still counted, sometimes, when the ground tilted. But now, when he did it, on the bar of the winch mid-river, he would feel Yorsha's shoulder take the weight beside his, and she would count with him 4, 5, 6, not because either of them was afraid, but because the same numbers that once drove a wagon to a block now turned a rope that carried free people across a river, and a sound could change its meaning if you lived long enough and paid enough to earn it. He never asked her to forgive him. She never said the word. But one evening she took the old cord from her wrist, worked it loose, 3 strands over, and braided a single strand of it into a new cord she tied at his. Not a ring, not a vow, just a knot from a place he had helped destroy, and helped, in the smallest possible way, to carry forward. It was not the end of what he owed. It was the beginning of paying it awake. Which moment hit you hardest? The flinch she tried to hide on the block, the dipper of water at the ford, or the coin she finally refused to send back? Tell me in the comments. I read everyone. If this story reached into your chest the way it reached into Bram's, give it a like so more people find it, and subscribe for the next tale in the Orkbond saga. There are more debts on this river, and more people learning to pay them awake.